Okay, in this video, we're going to be looking at Key Concept 6.2, Global Conflicts and Their Consequences, and we're going to be focusing on the aspect of the ideologies of anti-imperialism that begin to surface after World War I. During the 1920s and the 1930s, after the Great War, and then during the Great Depression, intellectuals and political activists in Asia, but also in Africa and in Latin America, begin to challenge the ideological and the economic basis of imperialism, and nationalist and anti-imperialist movements begin to gain strength in each of those regions. So this video is going to focus on Asia, where we'll look at India, where you see a strong nationalist movement beginning to threaten the hold of the British Empire on the subcontinent. And then we're going to look at East Asia. We'll look at Japan's militarist leaders who sought to build national strength through empire expansion. And then we'll look at China, where the Qing dynasty is going to come to an end, leading to the rise of the nationalist government, but also a civil war that's being fought between adherents of different competing visions of what the new Chinese state is going to look like, as you can see in this drawing. So first, we're going to look at India, and we're going to look at their quest for home rule. So let's review real quick the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, where the soldiers of the British East India Company revolt and basically mutiny against the company, and that leads to the interference of the British government in Indian affairs. The Crown takes control of India away from the East India Company and basically makes India a colony of the British Empire. And with that came advantages for some of the ruling classes of India, and many people in those upper classes were able to receive European or Western educations, many of them going to European universities, going to study in London, as is the case of the nationalist leader Mohandas Gandhi that we're going to look at. So by the late 1800s, you see a movement of Indian nationalism growing, and there is a group called the Indian National Congress that is formed of these educated elites. Now, after World War I, you begin to see more organization by the Indian National Congress. And then another group that you're going to look at is the Muslim League. Now, the Muslim League was formed partly by the kind of instigation, you could kind of say, of the British government, because in the 1800s, Britain didn't want to lose control of the colony, and they noticed that there were divisions between the Muslims and the Hindus of India. Now, under colonial rule, these differences kind of, they don't disappear, but the tensions are eased between the different ethnic groups in India, as they're all controlled by the British, and as all of the subcontinent is brought under one. But when the nationalist movement develops, Britain actually fosters the development of the Muslim League to kind of throw off the balance of the Indian National Congress, hoping to kind of create a little disunity and prevent them from uniting against the British. So after World War I, both organizations become dedicated to achieving independence, and a lot of them had supported World War I, hoping that after the war they would actually be granted independence. Indian nationalists were inspired after the war by Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and his concept of self-determination, and also by the Russian Revolution, where they saw that the masses were able to oust the current political system that was there. But because of what happens after, they become very frustrated by the Paris Peace Settlement, because it doesn't include independence for the colonies. So Wilson's point of self-determination really only applied to the European countries, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the people in that empire, the creation of Czechoslovakia and of Yugoslavia, and then of the Russian lands that were taken, Latvia and Estonia, Lithuania, and Finland. But it didn't really apply to the colonies. After World War I, most European countries actually tightened their hold on their colonies. And in India, the British responded to the nationalist movement with very repressive measures. And out of this comes Mohandas Gandhi, who was the leader of Indian nationalism. He was, unlike, the Gandhi you tend to see Gandhi towards his older age, when he was very dedicated to fasting and to self-sacrifice for Indian independence. But he was raised in a well-to-do Hindu family. He studied law in London. He spent 25 years in South Africa, where the British also had colonial claims. and he embraced tolerance and nonviolence as his movement when he arrives to India. He develops this technique of passive resistance, and actually he had this coming from South Africa, where he helped organize strikes against the unfair treatment of the Indian immigrants in South Africa. But when he develops passive resistance, he begins to follow a more simple life, and he becomes a political and spiritual leader called Mahatma, the Great Soul. And as he begins to call for independence in India, he also begins to show opposition for the caste system, especially the exclusion of the untouchables. And he begins to gain the support of the majority of the subcontinent because of this. He is very, even though he came from a well-to-do Hindu family, he is showing support even for the untouchables and for the end of the caste system. From 1920 to 1922, he leads a non-cooperation movement, which is a form of passive resistance. Again, he was a very strong proponent of nonviolence, of the policy of ahimsa. So the non-cooperation movement was basically do not cooperate with what the Europeans are asking of the Indian people. In 1930, he also leads the civil disobedience movement. You have the Salt March, where protesting the charging of salt calls on the people to go out to the sea and just take the salt from the shore where it's free, rather than buying it from companies that are exploiting the Indian workers. Also, after the war, there is a British massacre in 1919 in Amritsar, and 379 demonstrators are killed by the British government, and this begins to arouse the public. The repression that they were trying to put on India failed, and so the British begin to offer a modified self-rule through the India Act, and that happens in 1937. So it wasn't immediate. There was a repression, like there were in a lot of colonies after World War I, as the Europeans try to kind of strengthen their hold on these possessions. But finally, in 1937, they give India a modified self-rule. It's still under the British Crown, but it's unsuccessful because India's 600 princes refuse to support it. So remember, India has always had a strong tradition of decentralization, and while they're technically under the British government, actually governing that large area is left up to these local princes. So that is one of the reasons why the India self-rule doesn't gain a lot of support, because they don't want to kind of give up their autonomy of their regions. Muslims also wouldn't cooperate because they wanted an independent state. And so by 1937, divisions between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had really splintered the two groups. And as they're both seeking independence, they're not seeking to create one country, but the Muslims actually want their own country. They want an independent state. The Great Depression worsens the conflict between Hindus and Muslims, because they see that there is an equality when it comes to getting the higher paying jobs and which group is being more affected by the economic depression. The Muslims believe that the Hindus were discriminating against them, and they believe that if India became independent, the Hindus would be the majority and they would pass laws that favored Hindus. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which was the head of the Muslim League, proposes that two states be created. One of those would be Pakistan, and then one of those would be India. And so that's where we'll leave India there. We'll continue to look at India when we study chapter 39. So this is all happening right before World War II, but when the war comes, things are kind of put on hold for the British, and India will eventually achieve its independence, but it won't achieve its independence until 1947, until after World War II, and we'll study that when we get to chapter 39. So now let's turn to China as we look at China's search for order. Now, the Qing dynasty comes to an end in 1911, and the Republic is declared. The Republic was a revolution in 1911, but it doesn't establish a stable republic. Instead, China falls into the rule of the different warlords, as happened way back during the Warring States period after the Zhou dynasty. And then again, we saw them have warring kingdoms and warring states after the fall of the Han dynasty, before the Sui dynasty. So again, once again, China falls back to these warlords who don't want to give up their rule. Through unequal treaties, foreign states still control the economy of China. So you also see European attitudes developing in addition to internal conflict. So Chinese nationalism begins to grow after this 1911 revolution. Intellectuals again expected the Paris Peace Conference to end the treaty system. They were hoping again for Woodrow Wilson's point of self-determination to apply to the European holdings in China. But instead, the Paris treaties approved Japanese expansion into China because of Japan's participation in the war. So one of these movements against this was the May 4th movement, where Chinese youth and intellectuals began to oppose imperialism, and that begins to attract a lot of followers, and it kind of begins to unite the people, but there are still a lot of differences between ideologies of what this new China, this new republic is going to look like. Some are attracted to Marxism and Leninism, which they see unfolding in Russia, where the peasants and the working class have taken the government over from the elites that have held it from the Tsarist government. And the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is established in 1921. So in this period of instability, of not really having one particular Chinese government, you see the rise of two competing groups, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Kuomintang, or sometimes you'll see it spelled KMT, Kuomintang, because of the two different ways that we spell when we speak English, how we spell Chinese using our alphabet. So it's either the Kuomintang or the Kuomintang, and that's the Nationalist Party. The Kuomintang leader was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who favored democracy and nationalism. But the leader of the Communist Party was Mao Zedong. He was more of an advocate of socialism. He also advocated for women's equality. And remember, in China, that's a big deal. China has been one of those societies that has been a strong patriarchal society for thousands of years. And here comes Mao Zedong advocating for the equality of women. So the two parties form an alliance, and they're actually assisted by the Soviet Union against foreigners in the 1920s into the 1930s. But after the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925, a new leader takes over, Yang Yishi, also Chiang Kai-shek, again, same person. And both parties launched the Northern Expedition to try to reunify China. And it's successful, but then Chiang Kai-shek turns on his communist allies. He doesn't like the communists, and he also doesn't want to have the support of the Soviet Union. And he does manage to drive the communists out, defeats them, but between 1934 and 1935, the Chinese Communist Party retreats to Yan'an in what is known as the Long March, and they actually walk for 6,215 miles. So it looked like they had been defeated, but Mao Zedong uses that long trek, that long march, to kind of rally the people back together and saying, look, even though we were defeated in these battles, even though we were ousted by Chiang Kai-shek, we've stuck together through this hard journey. And he emerges as a stronger leader of the Communist Party, and he develops a Maoist ideology, which was similar to Lenin's ideology in Russia. However, Mao applied the idea of a revolution to a peasant revolution rather than a workers' revolution, because most Chinese were peasants. So now you have two competing factions that are still vying for power in China. And then Japan comes along and begins to create an empire. And as Japan invades China, the two forces again put their differences aside to try to hold off the Japanese. Neither side is able to do it successfully. So we'll leave the Chinese story at that point right now. And spoiler alert, the communists are eventually going to win. I think you know that already. So that's where we'll leave it. And now let's take a look at what Japan was doing then. So how is it that Japan invades China? And really, a lot of people mark the beginning of World War II with the Japanese invasion of China. So let's turn our attention to Japan. Japan emerged from the Great War as a world power. They participated in the treaties, in the negotiations. They took part in the League of Nations that was formed after World War I. They signed a treaty with the United States that guaranteed China's integrity, saying that they will respect China. Remember, Japan had already been expanding into the area before, as they were trying to collect resources for their industrialization. So The Japanese economy was actually boosted by the war because they sold munitions to the Allies. Like the United States, the Japanese mainland was not attacked. It was not at war during the Great War. So their factories were not damaged, and their economy was boosted just like the economy of the United States as a result of the war. But labor unrests lead to a short-lived prosperity. The economy begins to slump during the Depression, and because of labor unrests, people began to demand social reforms. So like every other country that was tied into the system, that was connected economically, Japan is also hit by the Great Depression. Political conflict then emerges between internationalists, who were people who supported Western-style capitalism. These are the people who supported the Westernization before. And then nationalists, people who were hostile to foreign influences, people who wanted to focus strictly on Japan. So these nationalists were the ones that were beginning to take control of the military and establish a more militaristic form of government. In 1931, we begin to see the world kind of marching closer to war with the Mukden incident in China, or in Manchuria, 1931, which was part of China. Chinese unification had threatened the Japanese interests in Manchuria because a strong, united China would have wanted all that territory back from that was part of the Qing territory. So Japanese troops destroy train tracks on a Japanese railroad, and they claim that the Chinese were responsible for the attack. And that incident becomes a pretext for Japan to attack China, and Japan goes to war. The military, which was acting without any civilian authority, took over all of Manchuria by 1932, and that becomes the first time that the League of Nations is tested. The League of Nations was created after World War I so that they could avoid another war. And just the fact that it's called World War I, we know there was a World War II, and therefore we know the League of Nations didn't really work. So the League of Nations calls for Japan to withdraw. And they call for the withdrawal of the Japanese troops and the restoration of the Chinese sovereignty to Manchuria. Well, Japan simply responded by leaving the League of Nations. And so that was the first test. And that's going to be key because other powers with desires for territorial expansion, like the fascists in Italy, like the Nazis in Germany, are going to see the League of Nations' stance against Japan as really ineffective. The League of Nations didn't have any backbone to enforce their actions. They could say, Japan, we want you to withdraw from China, but they didn't have a military authority. They didn't have enough. Germany wasn't a part of it. Russia wasn't a part of it. And if you remember, the United States wasn't a part of the League of Nations, even though it was their idea, because the Senate of the United States didn't want to become entangled in European affairs. So there weren't really any strong nations that were doing well economically and could militarily force Japan out of China. So as a result, Japan just leaves the League of Nations, and the new militant Japanese government takes hold. They begin to develop a new militaristic national identity, as you can see in some of these slides. And you could look at these slides and you could see how focused not only just the men, but the women and the children were on creating a militaristic government. And this begins to set the stage for more Japanese expansion. So this is when really we begin to see the march towards the Second World War, because Japan is going to begin to expand its aggression more into China. And we'll look at that once we look at the beginning of World War II. So again, we'll leave Japan at that point, where it has now gone from being a Western imitator that we saw happening before World War I to now a fascist militaristic form of government, more like the governments that we see developing in Italy and in Germany. Okay, so that's it for today, and make sure that you review this section and look ahead to the next section so that you can see how anti-colonialism, this movement towards trying to get rid of European influence, spreads and impacts Africa.